In the battle against hunger, the United Nations has to make life-saving decisions every day. Knowing who to reach, when to act, and how to deliver depends on the latest information and the best evidence. But in fragile and conflict settings, areas where need is greatest, good evidence is hard to find and the results are difficult to measure.
Meow! Huples cat. I'm going to talk about food scarcity and food insecurity, and how it might affect North America and Europe over the coming months, mainly because of the black swan event of COVID-19 disease. Because there's a lot of information out there, and as United Nations says, where it's critical we're not really getting that much information. But if we actually take a bit of a deep dive into what's going on, there is good news and bad news, and like everything related to COVID-19 in April 2020, the answers aren't really that clear cut, however much people want them to be. Of course, food hunger, starvation, has been around since people have been around. And this was before COVID. Almost 1 billion people regularly go to bed hungry at night, and many of them are actually in your own neighborhoods in North America. We'll get into food insecurity as opposed to food scarcity in a bit. So they say it's man-made conflicts, but again it's people conflicts, because women cause conflicts as well. Just a little bit of PC for you guys there. But COVID-19 will not make food insecurity any better. So obviously the continent of Africa is much more at risk from this than Canada or the United States or even Mexico. But there is disturbing signs in the wind and on the ground that is leading people like Brad, Full Spectrum Survival, and myself to encourage people to actually start to hoard foodstuffs, basic foodstuffs in their homes and in their bug out locations, because we feel that the scarcity might become shortage. And shortage might become no food. Now that's kind of a scary leap, and it's probably not going to happen that millions to tens of millions of people in North America and Europe will go to bed hungry at night or starve to death in the streets. That's highly unlikely. What is likely is that we will continue to see shortages of our main products based on a whole bunch of different things. But for the people of the continent of Africa and parts of Asia and South America, that actually could result in mass starvation and death. The last time we had a situation like this was 2008. It caused what was known as the Arab Spring, though it wasn't necessarily just Arabs. Large sections of the population of many countries on the planet Earth are dependent on government directly or indirectly for food subsidies. When food prices spike, those subsidies have become inefficient and not very good, because most of those countries' governments are actually broke and are heavily in debt. So without debt relief and without extra food supplies because the price has gone up, starvation, hunger starts to occur, and most of those countries also have a disproportionately large younger population, which results in rioting and changes of government. This in 2008 was seen by many on the left as a good thing, because it was supposed to bring democratic freedoms and therefore a boost to capitalism in many repressive dictatorial regimes around the world. I think it's safe to say, in 12 years later in 2020, that lofty, hopeful goal didn't happen. Nor do I expect the results of COVID-19 disease to be a freedom around the world and an increase in capitalism, good capitalism. I don't expect that, but that's another issue. So what we have in 2020 is we have a world approaching 8 billion people. We have a very highly developed, technologically integrated agricultural sector and trading and transport sector to give most people on the planet more food than they actually require most of the time. But a number of people are, usually because of civil war or localized climate change drought issues, having very difficulty feeding themselves. That causes widespread migration, because people are going to move rather than die mostly, and everybody has a cell phone everywhere now, so they are looking at what we're doing here whilst they're trying to figure out which of their last 2 goats they're going to have to slaughter, right? So that's the issue, is that right now we have a world that has pretty much maxed out, unless we figure out something new, pretty much figured out that we know that we're going to run out of food to feed the population globally. We know that. We're doing everything we can. We're looking at different ways of doing things. We're looking at aquaponics, blah, blah, blah. There's all different things that could do this. The world of Malthus in the 19th century said that we'd all be dead in the 20th century from starvation, and that wasn't true because we applied technology and huge quantities of petrochemicals to the agricultural process. But a shock like COVID-19 is going to do one thing. It's going to definitively drive up food prices. The reason for that is multifold and multi-confusion. It is due to various factors. Ports get closed because they're shut by their governments, because their governments are frightened of COVID-19 entering the port, or the port workers have COVID-19, or more typically, the governments become tribal and want to hoard their food because they anticipate shortages. And we see that not just in food, of course, we see that in medicines and pretty much everything. People get very local, very defensive in a threat environment. And for those people out there who don't understand COVID-19 disease, this is a global shtf. This is an ongoing threat environment.
Probably only about a third of the migrant labour that would normally come to the UK is here and was probably here before lockdown, and we are working with industry to identify an approach that will encourage those millions of furloughed workers in some cases to consider taking a second job helping get the harvest in June.
So, climate change is real for me and for most people who have studied it in a scientific way. Maybe it isn't for you. I don't really care. What I will say is that climate insecurity locally has caused reductions in food supply in North America, and that's a very critical factor. Very critical because North America, Canada, you always forget us, and the Midwestern states and California, the world is utterly dependent on those geographical areas to actually feed itself. Russia to some degree, China to some degree are exporters as well of most food supply, but we are very dependent. We need to understand that when trade constricts, flow of food will constrict, which will cause prices to rise, which will cause people to starve to death in poor areas of the world, and will cause political instability in large areas of the world, including America and Canada. So the other issue is, of course, who's collecting the food, who's working the farms. Obviously, if people aren't going to work because they're frightened, there will be a huge reduction in the amount of food collected. We don't really have supplies in depth. There's a lot of people out there think that we have all of this food supply. We do have large quantities of food stored up, but it actually, if you look at how many days that would feed the planet, it's not a lot. It doesn't take much to reduce food from being unstable and insecure for 1 billion out of 8 billion people to food being insecure and unstable for 2, 3, 4, maybe 5, 6 billion people. North America will use its military might and its economic might to feed its people, generally speaking. What will happen is that the ongoing issues that Europe's facing in terms of getting migrant workers in to actually collect the food and then get the food transported to the stores is a major factor in causing food insecurity and scarcity as a result of COVID-19. On top of that, of course, is economics. A lot of people around the planet are earning less money this year than they were doing at the beginning of the year. A lot of people. And the reason for that is because the economy is tanked. The economy is dead in the water. It's dropped by 10 to 30 to 40% in various sectors, and that will ongo and that will get worse. And no amount of opening up states or nail salons is going to really do too much for that. Obviously, as people know people who have COVID-19 disease and know people who've died from it, people are going to become less and less keen to open up their economy. Now, right now, people are reporting to me that fishermen are standing shoulder to shoulder fishing in parts of the United States and in Canada. Now, obviously, people are doing that. Some of those people don't believe in COVID-19 disease, and that's just fine. They can drink bleach. But most people who are doing that is because they don't have enough food. They're scared. They don't have enough income to buy the food. The food that they're trying to buy is getting higher and higher in price. China showed an average food spike of 30% during the early phase of COVID-19 disease. And I repeat, the early phase. It has not ended in China. Now, the same factor is here. Without decent socialism and government subsidies of cash to people en masse, people will go hungry. People are already really suffering. And a lot of preppers out there are already delving into their prepping supplies to make good a shortfall in what they would normally buy at the store. Now some people are doing it because they're smart and they don't want to go to the store because stores are full of people and people spread the disease. But a lot of people are doing it because they're economically really seriously impacted right now. So that's the issue. COVID-19 is going to increase price of food, it's going to make supply problems more and more acute, and it's going to make demand harder and harder to fulfill for people because they won't have the cash to actually provide the money to get the food that's going to become higher and higher in price and also reduce. It's not going to take much to cause widespread starvation on continental Africa that could result in a couple of 100 million people, men, women and children, dying. And a lot of people are going to say, well, there's too many people anyway, and that's always the case, and it's their own fault because they're black and it's corrupt. All of those statements are completely wrong, and I'm not going to get into why, but they are actually misinformation and not true, and also pretty harmful and crude and rude. What the issues are is that the continent of Africa has been exploited for so long that it's very, very hard to have the infrastructure in place to actually develop an agricultural technological society that can do things. Now obviously countries like China are investing massively in continental Africa because they want to secure food, not this year, they're thinking of 10-20 years from now. One of the problems with just-in-time capitalism, accumulative capitalism, is we don't tend to look very far in the future. Now capitalism does a lot of things well, but what it tends not to do very well is anticipate future issues and actually invest and spend today's profits on those issues. For example, N95s, it would have been a capitalist dream to have had warehouses full of them over the last 20 years so you could sell them at a huge markup now. They would have made so much money, it would have been smart, a winning strategy. But just-in-time capitalism says no, don't waste money storing stuff. Storing stuff costs money to store it, therefore just in time, just feed the demand as it occurs. And that's great until demand outstrips supply. And with food, demand will outstrip supply in North America as well as the whole globe over the next few months to possibly a year or two. So in the short term of a global shtf, capitalism stumbles and falls. What it needs is a strong central government and leadership to put in a lot of subsidies via debt, worry about the debt later on, to actually maintain it. Now a lot of you guys are going, no, socialism stinks, it's evil, we don't want to be like Venezuela. You're looking at extreme examples, and this is a global war, this is a global shtf. And I'm going to use an example, bacon, to prove my thesis here, to give you people some idea about the calamity that's looming. It's looming real fast. This will not take more than a week or two to a month or two before we're going to see increasing shortages of basic foodstuffs in our supermarkets and mass starvation, mass famine, mass civil disruption in large areas of the globe, all of which will probably affect us adversely. This is going to be a really tough time. Now, as the full results of the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 causing COVID-19 disease became known, all the world's stock markets plummeted. They dropped in almost all sectors, other than a few sectors like PPE manufacturers. And this led, of course, to unemployment, large-scale unemployment on a scale not seen since 2008 and probably won't be as seen again, and probably will be as bad or worse than the Grand Recession in the 1930s. This is kind of horrifying. But what's this going to do for food? In the short term, it puts prices of food up because there's less customers. So economy of scale starts to fail. Less people can afford to buy more expensive food, so less people buy it, therefore it becomes more difficult and more expensive to produce it. Then you get factories shutting down, and I call them factories. It's where we slaughter animals. It's disgusting how the people live there and how people work in there. But they're all shutting down. They're shutting down in Canada as well as America, and remember, a lot of the meat trade around the planet originates out of us. Europe has some effects for this, but I believe they're also experiencing some shortages. And of course, governments are going to hoard food. They're going to get scared. They're going to run out for their people, and they're going to be less keen to export what they have, even if they have it in abundance and need the cash. It's a time of crisis, a time of fear. So you can see here, Vietnam has reduced rice exports. Russia has halted grain exports, and Russia's a pretty big player in feeding continental Africa with grain. Pakistan has suspended a whole bunch of stuff as well, and that's just some of multiple examples. So because there's less people working in the factories and there's less people actually in the factories because they're shutting them down, we've switched a lot of their supply to frozen inventories, and frozen inventories are not going to last very long. There's hundreds of millions of pounds, but there's hundreds of millions of North Americans and Canadians and Europeans and Chinese and Japanese gobbling meat. So not surprisingly, we're seeing a ton of products disappearing from the shelves, causing a run on meat because people see it's disappearing, so people grab it and hide it. I know people are out there buying freezers to hoard meat. So the processed meat is becoming much more expensive. However, the farmers are getting paid much less for the animals, less and less and less, because there's nowhere to actually convert them into products. So a good example is bacon. Bacon has doubled in price in a 4-day period, and it's still showing signs of rising. But at the same time, there's less and less hogs being moved for slaughter because the cost is becoming less and less keen for farmers to actually send their animals for slaughter. It's a vicious cycle, and it can only be done by government intervention, turning around and saying, no, you have to give good prices to the meat producers, the farmers, otherwise we're going to run out of food. So yeah, you're in the short term paying them less and less because you've got less factories to do it in, but those factories are going to reopen, and this is how we're going to do it. You need a central command control economy to actually deal with a supply shock and a demand shock that's unprecedented on the scale that COVID-19 faces us all with. So that's the insane thing. Pigs are costing less and less and less, and the ability to turn them into products is becoming more and more restricted. So the finished products are becoming more and more expensive. It's a mess. It has to be addressed, and the only way to address it outside of capitalism is for the government to step in. If we leave it up to capitalism to address, at some point the farmers all go bust and the pork producers are no longer there, and therefore the slaughterhouses can't make bacon and pork chops and make a ton of money, and then they'll start to reinvest into the farms again to get more supply to keep their profits up. Craziness. This is the same that we're seeing with American hospitals shutting down because they can't do elective surgery, so there's no profit in staying open, whereas the government should be saying to them, you stay open, and this is how you're going to stay open, and this is what we're going to give you to stay open, and this is the work we're now going to get you to do in this emergency. But that's not happening. The invisible hand of capitalism really cannot operate in an shtf on a global scale anywhere near as efficiently as, unfortunately, for some of you people out there who are stuck on ideology, as a centralized government can do. That is the solution. To get people into the fields to harvest the products, to get people into the factories to produce the food, and then to make sure that we can supply it via the truckers. So if you believe in capitalism and you like to eat bacon, you really need to be supporting command control socialism right now in your country. You need a strong central government to redistribute money, because the capitalist system can't do it efficiently or effectively in a global shtf. If you want to have an ongoing supply of bacon at reasonable prices and, crucially, have an income to pay for it, most people in the world are going to require the government to intervene to make sure that happens in the short term. What's going to happen in the long term is things will get back to normal. We don't know when, but when they get back to normal, the countries that have used strong command control to keep large sections of their economy functional in a time where otherwise they wouldn't be functional are going to be in a prime position to take command of the re-emerging rebound economy post-pandemic. Now that could be next month, next year, or the year after. Nobody knows when this pandemic is going to be over. Nobody knows that. But I really am worried about the United States of America and Canada to some degree, that we're putting ourselves in a position that we're trying to use capitalism to deal with a global shtf, and capitalism's really bad at that. What capitalism's great at doing is to give confidence to the markets by the government, not by inflating the Dow, that's just wasting money, but actually employing direct subsidies to things like Roots Canada to make PPE for hospital workers in the short period of time that we're going to have the pandemic on a global scale affecting us all, to actually give confidence and economic boost to most workers, most of the places, so they're actually producing stuff that helps with the global shtf, not just being laid off and then suffering more and more food insecurity, having to go out and fish shoulder to shoulder, catching COVID-19 and making the problem a whole lot worse. The answer to this is not to reopen nail salons, but to send nail salon workers into the fields at reasonable rates to harvest corn by hand if they have to in some parts of the world, but in the West send those beauty technicians into care homes to give care to old people, right? We are in a world war. We can't rely on supply and demand, crash and boom to get us through this. We have to keep our economies and our people safe and productive as far as we can. And yes, we need to have physical distancing, and we need to re-engineer and refigure out a whole bunch of different things, and we need to do it last week, not a month from now. And we need to have very flexible, very efficient command and control central governments. And states can do this, provinces can do this, and they are doing it en masse, doing this. But nothing really beats a strong central government that people respect and will listen to, that's making the right choices to deal with the issue we face with now. Not making choices based on how it used to be or how it will be, but what is actually going on right now. Now, I appreciate that a lot of you will just reject this en masse because you do not believe in socialism, and I say to you, good luck with your businesses. Nobody's going to be paying for pool cleaning this summer. Nobody's going to be buying stuff that we normally do in our service economies. For goodness sake, if our governments don't step up and employ us to do work that's of meaning in the now, we're all going to be in an awful lot of trouble. So thanks for listening to this. I hope you enjoyed it, if only to make you annoyed. I hope it gives you some food for thought. Do listen to Brad of Full Spectrum Survival and others and me, because honestly, I do think food's going to be a prime issue of insecurity and possibly scarcity and possibly zero availability for all of us, including us in North America. We haven't experienced this since World War II. I think we're going to experience it again. I know some people already are. I know some people already were before COVID-19. But I think we're looking at the majority of North Americans suffering from food insecurity and scarcity over the summer of 2020. If you're in a position now to stockpile basic food supply like rice and pasta and canned tomatoes, do so. If you have a garden, maximize the use of that garden for food stuff. If you have extra, give it to friends and neighbours when you need to. Don't hoard the food for 20 years from now. This is going to be a 1 to 2 year event, I believe. During that 1 to 2 year, we have to work together. We have to love one another. We have to really not be very, very selfish. Selfish accumulation of capital is not going to fix a pandemic. That's all from me. Wherever you are in the world, stay safe and be kind and think about this. And I do welcome VRs to this, and I also welcome comments to this. It's my take on it. I feel a bit bad using bacon as an example because I'm a vegan and I don't really think you need to eat bacon, and I think it's kind of cruel. But a lot of people do eat bacon, and that's their choice. Your bacon is going to get very, very rare and very, very expensive, and it doesn't need to. And the producers of the bacon are going to suffer huge economic downturn and stress, possibly resulting in suicide and farm failures en masse if central government doesn't intervene. This was a Bad Terrier 2020 production. Just wear a mask. Right, Becky?